Daveth Korrin stood in the designated equipment collection zone on day one of the Advanced Wilderness Integration course, watching his classmates from 17 different species reluctantly surrender their survival kits to the instructors. The corral conducting the confiscation possessed that particular brand of chitinous patience that comes from having exoskeletons and clipboard mentalities. They could wait forever, and your discomfort nourished them spiritually. One by one, the students approached the collection tables. Thermal regulators went into bins. Nutrient synthesizers, carefully calibrated for each species' biochemistry, were tagged and stored. Communication devices, emergency beacons, even the Hevrani student's ceremonial fire starter that she'd inherited from her clutch mother, all of it disappeared into cargo containers with the finality of taxes or entropy. This was, the orientation materials had emphasized repeatedly, the galaxy's most prestigious survival certification program. The place where species proved they could adapt to uncolonized worlds without the cushion of technology. The crucible where theory met terrain, and only the genuinely competent emerged certified. Daveth noticed the visible anxiety rippling through the group as students were left with nothing but their standard-issue jumpsuits, climate-neutral, moderately durable, and spectacularly unhelpful for any specific task. A Vexillian 2 rows ahead kept recalculating something on his fingers, muttering about energy conservation coefficients. A Metharian's thermal signature flickered nervously, visible even to Daveth's limited human spectrum. The lead instructor, whose name translated approximately to persistent evaluation, raised one foreleg for attention. You will be monitored from orbit but otherwise unassisted for 30 planetary rotations on testing ground Sigma 9, the world beneath us. This is a Class M environment, marginally hostile, nutritionally viable, meteorologically stable within documented parameters. Your survival is statistically probable. Your comfort is not our concern. Your learning is inevitable, whether you wish it or not. Inspirational stuff, really. The kind of speech that made you want to march confidently into the wilderness and immediately regret every decision that led to this moment. The shuttle departed 20 minutes later, its engines fading to a whisper and then silence, leaving 43 students standing in a river valley between two forested ridges under a sky the color of old bruises. Daveth watched it go, already cataloguing the tree line in the distance, mixed deciduous, some kind of pine analog on the higher elevations, dense undergrowth suggesting significant moisture retention. Beside him, the Vexillian began calculating optimal energy conservation strategies aloud to anyone who would listen, which was everyone, because panic makes people seek structure even when that structure is someone else's anxiety presented as mathematics. Daveth started walking. The valley ran roughly north-south, perhaps 2 kilometers long and half that wide, with the river cutting through its eastern third. Late afternoon sun, this planet's star, burned slightly cooler than Sol, but the difference was negligible to unaugmented human perception, cast long shadows from the western ridge. He walked the perimeter slowly, ignoring the growing cluster of students behind him who were forming discussion groups about shelter priorities and resource allocation. Water source, the river, obviously, flowing south to north, with enough current to suggest reliable depth. He'd need to test potability, but movement was a good sign. Stagnant water killed you slower than thirst, but with more creativity. Wind patterns, consistent from the east, channeled by the valley's shape, carrying the green smell of living forest and something else underneath, something like overripe fruit or early decomposition. Useful information. That wind told you about microclimates, about where warmth collected and where it fled. Terrain features, rocky outcroppings on both ridges, sedimentary by the look of them, which suggested specific geological histories, and more importantly specific stone types with specific fracture properties. The valley floor was primarily soil over clay. He could tell by how his boots compressed the ground, with scattered rocks that had tumbled from higher elevations over timescales that made human empires look like summer vacations. Vegetation types, 3 distinct biomes visible from here. Riverside plants that loved moisture and tolerating flooding. Valley floor species adapted to moderate water and full sun. Ridge vegetation that dealt with exposure and thinner soil. Each zone meant different potential resources, different edible possibilities, different material properties. He crouched near the riverbank, examining tracks in the mud. Something with 3 toes, medium-sized, recent enough that water hadn't fully reclaimed the impressions. Something else, smaller, with a dragging tail mark. Herbivore and predator maybe, or 2 herbivores with different locomotion strategies. Insufficient data for conclusions, but sufficient for hypothesis formation. The bark on the nearest tree showed vertical stress patterns and unusual darkening on the eastern side. Weather damage or photosynthetic adaptation. He'd need multiple observations across different specimens. The soil, when he dug his fingers into it, had good structure, organic content, decent drainage, the kind of composition that suggested robust microbial activity, and therefore the kind of decomposition cycles that made ecosystems actually function. Behind him, someone called out, asking what he was doing. Daveth waved vaguely without looking back, which was probably rude but also honest. He was doing what he was always doing, looking at what was actually there instead of what theory said should be there. A Metharian student, Quilix, according to the name badge they'd all been issued, approached the growing group with a proposal. They should designate a central meeting point, establish a communication schedule, create task rotations to maximize efficiency while minimizing individual energy expenditure. It was logical, systematic, and would absolutely work right up until the point where it encountered something the system hadn't anticipated, at which point it would fail comprehensively, because systems designed in committee rarely survived contact with reality's sense of humor. Daveth agreed pleasantly when Quilix asked for consensus. Central meeting points were fine. Communication schedules hurt nothing. While others discussed implementation details, he pocketed several river stones he'd noticed, dense, fine-grained, with the kind of conchoidal fracture patterns that meant they'd hold an edge if you knew how to convince them. That night, while other students huddled together for warmth and morale in the valley's center, Daveth slept under a rocky overhang he'd identified during his perimeter walk. It was positioned to block the eastern wind, elevated 3 meters above the current river level, with geological evidence suggesting that was above historical flood markers, and his back rested against stone that had absorbed the day's heat and was now radiating it back with the slow generosity of thermal mass. He slept adequately, which was the best you could hope for on night 1 of anything, really. Day 2 arrived with the inevitability of day 2, which is to say obviously but somehow still surprisingly. Daveth woke before dawn, a habit from years of farm work, where the work didn't care about your sleep preferences, and spent the early light observing animal behavior. Birds, or bird analogues at least, followed specific flight patterns that suggested feeding territories. Small mammals, or something mammal-adjacent, moved through the underbrush with timing that indicated predator avoidance strategies. The river itself showed fish activity, subtle surface breaks that meant feeding on insects or underwater vegetation. By the time other students were stirring, he'd mapped 17 distinct animal behaviors, identified 3 potentially edible plant species based on what animals were eating. a heuristic, not a guarantee, but a starting point for careful testing, and located a clay deposit where the river curved against the western bank. Days 3, 4, and 5 established the rhythm. Most students adopted what they considered a logical conservation approach: minimal movement, careful energy expenditure, treating this as an endurance trial where the goal was to change as little as possible while time passed. They established their camp in the valley's center, arranged watch rotations, discussed theoretical survival principles with the kind of intensity usually reserved for religious debates or arguments about correct sandwich construction. Daveth continued his routine, mornings observing animal behavior and plant growth patterns, which species flowered when, which lost leaves, which seemed to track the sun, and which ignored it. Afternoons testing hypotheses in small, careful increments. These leaves grew near water sources. Did they indicate potability, or were they thriving on something toxic to his biology? These insects avoided certain plants. Was that defense mechanism something he should also avoid, or was it species-specific? Where did fish congregate in the river, and did that pattern change with temperature or time of day? Evenings he processed his findings, which mostly meant sitting still and thinking about what he'd observed, looking for patterns that might indicate deeper principles. He wasn't antisocial. He shared information when asked, contributed to group discussions about weather predictions and resource locations, but he was clearly operating on a different wavelength than students who'd arrived with theoretical frameworks and were trying to apply them like template overlays onto resistant reality. By day 5, he'd identified 6 edible plant species through careful testing. Small quantities, wait for reactions, increase gradually, the patient methodology that kept you alive more reliably than optimistic assumptions. He'd located clay deposits at 3 different river points, each with slightly different composition. He'd found stones near the western ridge that fractured like flint, which meant cutting edges were possible, and he'd identified trees with bark that could be processed into cordage based on fiber structure. Other students began noticing he looked increasingly comfortable while they looked increasingly haggard. Rations were holding, but morale was depleting faster than calories. When you spent your days conserving energy and your nights hoping morning would somehow be easier, time acquired a weight that made 30 rotations feel like geological epochs. Quillix approached him on day 6. During the afternoon period, most students spent resting. Daveth Korrin, your strategy is unclear to observational analysis. What operational framework are you implementing? Daveth looked up from the bark he'd been examining for fiber density. I'm learning what the planet is trying to teach me. Quillix's thermal signature flickered through 3 colors that probably meant something in Meteorological emotional vocabulary. That is frustratingly non-quantifiable. Yeah, Daveth agreed. It really is. Days 7 through 12 were when observation converted to action, though the narrator, if this story had a proper narrator, which it didn't because reality rarely provided such conveniences, would emphasize this wasn't sudden inspiration or montage-ready competence. It was incremental, mistake-laden, and educational in the way that jamming your thumb with a hammer was educational. Daveth made tools because he'd spent nearly a week watching how this environment functioned and had developed theories about what might work here, in this place, with these materials. Sharp stones became cutting implements after he'd noticed how certain rocks fractured along specific planes when struck at particular angles. It took 47 attempts to produce his first genuinely useful blade, and the failures taught him more about stone composition than success ever would have. Long, straight branches he'd observed in the forest became poles and supports. Not because all branches were useful, but because he'd watched which trees produced straight growth, which had flexible wood versus brittle, which dried without excessive warping. Selection mattered more than processing. Clay from the riverbank became containers, eventually after he'd tested how different clay types behaved when dried in sun versus shade versus near fire heat, how thickness affected cracking, how adding specific plant fibers changed structural integrity. His first vessels crumbled. His second vessels crumbled slightly less. His third vessels crumbled in new and educational ways. His eighth vessels held water overnight, which felt like the kind of victory that deserved celebration, except he was too tired, and also the vessels were ugly enough to make aesthetics weep. Other students watched with increasing interest, particularly after the water-holding thing was demonstrated. Bress, a student built low to the ground with 6 limbs and a pragmatic disposition, asked to learn the stone napping technique. Daveth taught willingly. He'd never understood the hoarding of knowledge, which seemed like the intellectual equivalent of hoarding food until it rotted, but Bress struggled despite obvious intelligence and manual dexterity. "You are striking the stone incorrectly," Bress observed after the 5th failed attempt. "I'm striking it the same way I showed you," Daveth replied, demonstrating again. "Yes, but the result differs. This is frustrating. You're hitting it right, but you're not looking at where the force wants to go through this specific rock. See this grain here? The crystal structure runs this direction. You have to work with that, not against it. How do you perceive crystal structure through visual inspection? I don't. I guess based on how light hits the surface, how it sounds when tapped, how similar rocks fractured before. Mostly I'm wrong, but I'm wrong in educational ways." Bress eventually produced a serviceable blade on attempt 19, and the triumph in their postural language was visible across species boundaries. By day 12, Daveth had basic cordage processed from plant fibers he'd identified on day 4 and tested for strength across the week. He had 7 stone tools of varying sharpness and durability. He had 3 genuinely functional clay vessels and 2 more that held water only if you didn't trust them too much. And he had a growing detailed understanding of this ecosystem's food web, what ate, what, when, where, and how that information could be exploited, carefully without disrupting the balance that kept everything, including him, alive. He was also noticeably healthier than most students, having supplemented his rations with foraged additions, while others strictly conserved their original supplies out of caution that looked wise until you compared outcomes. Days 13 through 18 brought organization, though not the kind that emerged from planning sessions or hierarchy establishment. Daveth's personal camp area, still separate from the main group, not from antisocial tendencies, but because his routine required space and they'd already established their pattern, transformed gradually into something that reflected observation rather than imposition. His sleeping area was positioned based on 2 weeks of sun pattern documentation. Morning light hit this spot at a specific angle that provided warmth without the glare that destroyed sleep quality. Evening shade arrived early enough to prevent heat retention that made rest impossible. The ground had natural drainage that meant rain, which had occurred twice now, didn't pool. Food storage utilized temperature differentials he'd mapped between sun-exposed and shaded areas. Certain foods spoiled faster in heat. Others needed warmth to ripen properly. Storing everything in one location was organizationally tidy and nutritionally stupid. Water collection exploited morning dew patterns. He'd noticed certain leaves collected moisture more efficiently than others. Certain rock formations created condensation in predictable ways. 3 vessels positioned correctly gathered more water than 10 positioned randomly. Tool storage kept frequently used items within arm's reach of common task areas. stone blades near the cutting log, cordage near the area where he processed plant materials, fire-starting materials. He'd developed a friction method using specific wood combinations near the fire pit he'd established where prevailing winds naturally drew smoke away from the sleeping area. The organization wasn't imposed on the environment but worked with it. His waste disposal was located where insect and microbial activity was most aggressive based on 2 weeks of observation. Decomposition happened fastest in the northeast section, where moisture, temperature, and shade created optimal conditions. His workspace utilized afternoon light that was bright without being harsh. His water access path followed the route deer analogs used, which meant it was the easiest gradient and most stable ground. Other students began visiting, initially to acquire tools but increasingly to understand methodology. A Hevrani student named Tekesh, who'd been vocally dismissive of primitive technical approaches during week 1, spent an hour on day 16 watching Daveth repair a clay vessel. "Your process lacks systematic framework," Tekesh observed. Yet results demonstrate consistent functionality. Sometimes, this is disturbingly effective for something so unsystematic. Daveth shrugged, working clay into a crack with patient pressure. Systems are everywhere. You just have to recognize which one you're actually in instead of which one you want to be in. Tekesh's head tilted in the Hevrani expression that meant contemplation or digestive distress. The translator handled language, but cultural nuance required context. Explain operational distinction. Most of you arrived with systems from your education, your training, your species' approach to problems. Those are fine systems, but they're systems for general survival anywhere. I'm building a system for survival here, in this specific valley, on this specific planet, during these specific 30 rotations. My system will be completely useless anywhere else. Yours work anywhere, but maybe aren't optimized for here. Optimization through specificity, or just paying attention to what's actually happening instead of what should theoretically happen. By day 18, Daveth's camp had been visited by 31 of the 42 other students. His clay vessels had become communal resources. He produced extras and left them available because pottery hoarding seemed pointless. Also, he was getting better at making them, so the practice was useful. His tool-making techniques spread through demonstration and adaptation. Bress taught 3 other students the napping method, each developing slight variations based on their own manipulator morphology. His observation practices became topics of evening discussion. Which insects indicated weather changes? He'd noticed certain species swarmed before rain, others before temperature drops. Which animal behaviors suggested predator proximity? Which plants flowered in sequence, creating a calendar more reliable than counting days? What emerged wasn't a hierarchy with Daveth as leader. He explicitly avoided that role, having seen enough small-scale societies implode under leadership conflicts to know his temperament wasn't suited for authority. Instead, a knowledge-sharing network developed where his ground-level empirical observations complemented others' theoretical understanding. Quillix applied mathematical modeling to Daveth's empirical findings about river flow and fish behavior, creating predictions about optimal fishing times and locations that were more accurate than either approach alone. Bress used their lower perspective and different visual range to notice ground-level patterns. Daveth missed entirely root systems, substrate composition, smaller organisms. Tekesh's superior night vision identified nocturnal plant behaviors and animal movements that Daveth had only theorized about based on indirect evidence. The camp itself transformed gradually, not into Daveth's camp expanded, but into something new that incorporated observation-based adaptation as a principle rather than a specific technique. Shelters were repositioned based on microclimate mapping. Food storage diversified based on tested preservation methods. Water purification combined Daveth's clay filtration with Quilix's understanding of sedimentation rates and Tekish's identification of antimicrobial plants. The instructors, monitoring from orbit with sensors and occasional visual observation, noted this unexpected development in their reports. Statistical models had predicted moderate cooperation, but not integrated methodology development. The human subject kept appearing in notes with increasing frequency, always accompanied by phrases like non-standard approach and results inconsistent with training absence. Days 25 through 28 introduced the complication that raised stakes without violence, which was weather shift. The planet's meteorological patterns, stable for 24 days, changed dramatically over the course of 6 hours. Temperature dropped 15 degrees. Precipitation increased from occasional to persistent. Wind patterns that had been predictable from the east suddenly swirled chaotically as pressure systems reorganized. This wasn't instructor manipulation, it was seasonal transition, the kind of thing students should have anticipated if they'd been thinking about planetary cycles instead of just enduring current conditions. The testing ground designation meant the planet was studied, documented, and these shifts were in the briefing materials everyone had received, and most had skimmed while focusing on theoretical survival hierarchies. Panic threatened as shelters proved inadequate against rain that fell sideways. Food sources shifted as animals moved to different areas and plants responded to changed conditions. The careful equilibrium that had developed over 3 weeks suddenly faced pressures it wasn't designed for. Daveth's response on day 25, when the temperature first dropped and rain began falling with commitment, was more observation. Not because he had answers, but because panic without information was just faster dying. What was happening? Temperature drop significant but not fatal with proper shelter. Precipitation increase, problematic for current shelters but manageable with adaptation. Wind pattern changes meant previous assumptions about microclimate were temporarily invalid. What did it indicate? He watched tree sap flow changing, noticed certain animals moving from valley floor to ridge elevations, saw plants releasing seeds in what looked like preparation for something they'd experienced before, and he hadn't. What remained reliable? The river, though its level was rising. Geological features. Fire if you could keep it dry. Clay deposits. Stone tools. The knowledge network they'd built. The Northern Ridges caves, which he documented on day 3, but dismissed as unnecessary given adequate valley shelter, suddenly became relevant. He'd noted 3 entrances, varying depths, different exposure levels. Now he went back, this time with Quilix and Bress, documenting more carefully. 2 caves showed water damage, suggesting they flooded in heavy rain. The third, smallest, showed no such evidence and extended back far enough to provide genuine shelter. They moved the group's critical supplies there over day 26, not abandoning the valley camp, but creating redundancy. Plant species that had seemed useless in warm conditions suddenly showed value. Certain leaves repelled water more effectively than others, useful for shelter reinforcement. Trees that bent in the changed wind patterns indicated flexible wood that wouldn't snap, better for reconstruction than the rigid species that were fracturing. Dave's role shifted here. He wasn't solving the crisis alone, he didn't have those answers. But he helped others apply observation methodology to changed circumstances. What had the environment been telling them through animal behavior, plant cycles, geological evidence? What was it telling them now? What stayed constant versus what required new response? Takesh identified a nocturnal plant that bloomed during rain, producing berries that were nutritious and calorie-dense. In dry conditions, they'd been inedible, but moisture activated something in their chemistry. Bress found that certain ground-level fungi exploded in growth during wet periods, and while most were toxic, 2 species were safe and filling. Quillix's mathematical modeling of the weather shift predicted it would stabilize into a new pattern rather than continuing to intensify, which meant adaptation was viable rather than evacuation being necessary. By day 28, the weather had stabilized into its new configuration. Cooler, wetter, windier than before, but predictable within new parameters. The students had adapted shelters, diversified food sources, and most importantly, learned the deeper lesson that Daveth had internalized years ago on his grandmother's farm. Survival wasn't about static solutions, but responsive observation. The environment was always teaching. You just had to be paying attention to the curriculum. Day 29 was almost boring in its functionality. People checked shelters, gathered food, maintained fires, discussed plans for the final rotation with the kind of calm competence that came from surviving chaos. Day 30 arrived with anticlimactic punctuality. The instructors returned in the same shuttle, landing in the same valley clearing, approaching with clipboards and assessment materials. Persistent evaluation scanned the camp with compound eyes that registered far more visual information than human perception could process. Survival rate 100%. Injury rate 0.03%, all minor. Nutritional status above baseline average. Shelter adequacy exceeds minimum standards. Resource utilization significantly advanced compared to typical cohorts. Morale indicators surprisingly positive given absence of comfort amenities. Another instructor, whose name translated to something like quantified judgment, reviewed monitoring data on a tablet. Statistical anomaly requires explanation. This group demonstrated cooperation levels and knowledge integration exceeding predictive models by 37%. Methodology development occurred at rates inconsistent with expected individual species capabilities. The students lined up for individual assessments, answering questions about their strategies, lessons learned, skills developed. When Daveth's turn came, persistent evaluation spent longer than average reviewing his file. Daveth Korrin. Human. Limited formal survival training according to pre-course documentation. No wilderness certifications. Agricultural background, non-industrial context. Observation notes indicate non-standard approach to course requirements. I just paid attention to what the planet was doing. Dave said. Clarify operational methodology. The environment here had its own logic. I learned that logic instead of trying to impose logic from somewhere else. This approach lacks systematic framework. It had a framework. The framework was watch what happens, test small changes, accept feedback, adjust. That's pretty systematic. Quantified judgment looked up from the tablet. Monitoring data shows you expended significantly more energy than conservation models recommend. You created tools, then discarded them when circumstances changed. You developed location-specific solutions with no portability to other environments. By theoretical standards, your approach was inefficient. But I'm healthy, fed, and my camp worked. Yes, this is the statistical anomaly requiring explanation. Persistent evaluation made notes with the careful precision of someone who'd spent their entire life reducing reality to check boxes. Human subject appears to lack systematic survival training. Methodology unclear. Results exceptionally effective. Recommend further study of approach for potential integration into curriculum frameworks.